to celebrate the heritage of Hood Theological Seminary and to help create a broader academic environment for seminary students and faculty. The public is cordially invited to attend all lecture series sponsored by the seminary. In 2012, the seminary renamed the lecture series the Bishop Alfred E. and Mamie White Heritage Lecture Series. Bishop Alfred E. White was recognized as a compassionate and innovative pastor, building character and churches. The AME Zion Church recognized the extraordinary gifts of Alfred E. White when, in August 1984, the denomination's General Conference elected him as the 80th bishop in the line of succession in the AME Zion Church. His thirst for knowledge and considerable pastoral experience made Bishop White an exceptional and respected instructor at Hartford Theological Seminary and Livingstone College. He was a staunch advocate of ecumenicalism and social justice among people of diverse faiths. With deep gratitude, we acknowledge the presence of Reverend Gwendolyn Moore, the benefactor who established the endowment that funds the Bishop White Heritage Lectureship. This year, our lecturer is the Reverend Dr. Vanessa Lovelace. She comes to us with a BA from San Francisco State University, an MDiv from McCormick Theological Seminary, and a PhD from Chicago Theological Seminary. Dr. Lovelace is an experienced Hebrew Bible Old Testament scholar. She has taught introductory Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, biblical exegesis, elementary biblical Hebrew courses, womanist biblical interpretation, and Bible, race, gender, sexuality, and pastoral care. Dr. Lovelace is the Associate Dean and Associate Professor of Hebrew, Bible, and Old Testament at Lancaster Theological Seminary. Welcome, Dr. Vanessa Lovelace.
Thank you for that warm greeting, Dr. Hoskin Satterfield. And I bring you greetings on behalf of Lancaster Theological Seminary and Moravian Theological Seminary, which we are both combined under the Moravian University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. I would like to extend my thanks to the academic dean, Dr. Trevor Eppiheimer, and Dean of Students, Dr. Dora Mboye-Songo, and the Biblical Studies Department faculty for the invitation to deliver the 2024 Bishop Alfred E. and Mrs. Mamie White Endowed Heritage Lecture Series. It is my honor to have been chosen to deliver the lecture series established by Lancaster Theological Seminary alumnus and former Hood Theological Seminary president, Dr. Albert Aymer, may he rest in peace, and renamed for a giant in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church and his wife. My lecture title this evening is Maternity Matters, the intersection of race, ethnicity, gender, and class in Genesis 16 and 21:7. How did I get here? I asked myself. How did I become so focused in my recent scholarship on the subject of mothers and motherhood in the Hebrew Bible text and contemporary U.S. context, beginning with Sarah and Hagar? I have been surprised by the turn in my research because growing up, I had never, and I do mean never, been interested in maternal matters. I had not planned on being a mother. Yet, years later, I met and married a man with 2 children. Shortly after, I gave birth to our son. Although I am fiercely protective of my children, I side with researchers who argue that maternal instinct is a myth that men created. Even my dissertation was on Deborah and Huldah, 2 childless women prophets. Using feminist theory of gender and nation and womanist hermeneutical approaches, I argued that Deborah and Huldah functioned as symbolic border guards at each end of Israel's history in the Promised Land, from the period of settled life in Canaan, Palestine, to the exile when the elite members of Judah were forcibly taken to Babylonia. Feminist theories of gender and nation maintain that women and men contributed to national projects and processes. In contrast to such images as, for example, the founding fathers assembled at the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia mulling over the Declaration of Independence, feminist theorists of gender and nation insisted that women were not just passive objects of nationalist projects and processes, but also affected by them. And at this point, I'm going to share my screen. Of course, it is blocking what I can. There we go. So as I was saying, national projects have been limited, as male theorists argued that national projects were limited to the male imaginations and aspirations, and that women had nothing to do with it. But feminist theorists of gender and nation insisted that women were not just passive objects of nationalist projects and processes, but also affected them. Among the ways that feminist theorists argued that women participated were as biological reproducers of members of the nation, as central participants in the ideological reproduction of the boundaries of the group, transmitters of the nation's culture, symbolic signifiers of national difference, and as participants in national economic, political, and military struggles. In my dissertation, I focused on the idea of women as symbolic signifiers of national difference, or as national symbols. Examples of women symbolically figured as nations are La Patrie, during the French Revolution, figured as a woman in labor, or a lamenting woman with babe in arms, such as the Afrikaner Volksmoeder, Mother of the Nation in South Africa. Both symbolize the nation as women and children threatened with rape and murder by marauding outsiders to inspire patriotism in the men to come to her defense. Nations were also often symbolically figured as feminine in the Hebrew Bible. For example, in the prophetic texts, capital cities and nations are frequently figured symbolically as wives, mothers, daughters, and prostitutes. Thus, I concluded that Deborah and Huldah's barrenness symbolized the emptiness and despair that would befall Israel and Judah because they did not repent of their failure to live into their covenantal obligations. Along with feminist theory of gender and nation, the other framework I mentioned was a womanist hermeneutic. The term womanist, popularized by poet, author, and activist Alice Walker in her widely acclaimed publication, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, Womanist Prose in 1983, is derived from a term rooted in US Southern Black women's culture, womanish, a word used to describe an attempt to inhibit female adolescent behavior that was strong, outrageous, and sometimes spelt as inappropriate for their age, as in, you acting womanish, i.e., like a woman. In Search of Our Mother's Gardens includes the definition of a womanist as a, quote, Black feminist or feminist of color, end quote, imbued with Black women's sensibilities of being capable, serious, taking care of business, regardless. According to Walker, womanists appreciate themselves, their culture, their emotional flexibility, and their spirituality unconditionally, while also being inclusive. Walker's definition emphasizes connectedness to the entire community and the world and commitment to the entire community and the world, and commitment to the survival and wholeness of the entire community and world, regardless of race, gender, or sexuality. She concludes that, quote, womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender, end quote. Hers is not an attempt to bring Black women into the feminist movement, but rather the development of a way of knowing and being that values the lived experiences of Black women and women of color that is distinct philosophically and culturally from feminism. While I have described womanist attributes, a womanist approach examines phenomena such as gender and race from a simultaneously overlapping view for how they operate to discriminate against women of color. 19th century Black women activists such as Maria Stewart, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and Sojourner Truth named the simultaneity of their oppression as Black and female. Law professor Kimberly Williams in the 20th century, Kimberly Williams Crenshaw in the 20th century, also recognized that an individual's subjectivity is not impacted by race, gender, and class as essentially mutually exclusive categories. Rather, she explained that an individual's experiences were shaped by multiple and overlapping categories. Crenshaw applied a legal theoretical framework to the phenomenon of multidimensionality and its relationship to power in her investigation of how race and gender intersected to discriminate against U.S. Black women and make them invisible within their multiple political constituencies. She named that dynamic intersectionality. Crenshaw uses the metaphor of a traffic at an intersection to explain her argument. At this point, I'm going to share with you her video explaining it.
Many years ago, I began to use the term intersectionality to deal with the fact that many of our social justice problems, like racism and sexism, are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice. Now, the experience that gave rise to intersectionality was my chance encounter with a woman named Emma de Graffenried. I actually read about Emma's story from the pages of a legal opinion written by a judge who had dismissed Emma's claim of race and gender discrimination against a local car manufacturing plant. She applied for a job and she was not hired, and she believed that she was not hired because she was a Black woman. And the argument for dismissing the suit was that the employer did hire African Americans and the employer hired women. The real problem, though, that the judge was not willing to acknowledge was what Emma was actually trying to say. that the African Americans that were hired, usually for industrial jobs, maintenance jobs, were all men. And the women that were hired, usually for secretarial or front office work, were all white. Only if the court was able to see how these policies came together would he be able to see the double discrimination that Emma DeGraff and Reed was facing. But the court refused to allow Emma to put two causes of action together to tell her story because he believed that by allowing her to do that, she would be able to have preferential treatment. She'd have an advantage by being able to have two swings at the bat when African American men and white women only had one swing at the bat. But, of course, neither African American men or white women needed to combine a race and gender discrimination claim to tell the story of the discrimination they were experiencing. Why wasn't the real unfairness law's refusal to protect African American women simply because their experiences weren't exactly the same as white women and African American men? Rather than broadening the frame to include African American women, the court simply tossed their case completely out of court. So first of all, black women weren't allowed to work at the plant. Second of all, the court doubled down on this exclusion by making it legally inconsequential. And to boot, there was no name for this problem. And we all know that where there's no name for a problem, you can't see a problem. And when you can't see a problem, you pretty much can't solve it. Many years later, I'd come to recognize that the problem that Emma was facing was a framing problem. The frame that the court was using to see gender discrimination or to see race discrimination was partial and it was distorting. For me, the challenge that I faced was trying to figure out whether there was an alternative narrative, a prism that would allow us to see Emma's dilemma, a prism that would allow us to rescue her from the cracks in the law, that would allow judges to see her story. So it occurred to me, maybe a simple analogy to an intersection might allow judges to better see Emma's dilemma. So if we think about this intersection, the roads to the intersection would be the way that the workforce was structured by race and by gender. And then the traffic in those roads would be the hiring policies and the other practices that ran through those roads. Now, because Emma was both black and female, she was positioned precisely where those roads overlapped, experiencing the simultaneous impact of the company's gender and race traffic. The law was like that ambulance that shows up and is ready to treat Emma only if it can be shown that she was harmed on the race road or on the gender road, but not where those roads intersected. Heterosexism, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism, all of these social dynamics come together and create challenges that are sometimes quite unique.
There's a case I'd like to talk about.
Excuse me.
It's a favorite because it makes so many things abundantly clear. There was a group of
You don't know only about the Eagles.
I see inspiration right through my glass. So when my windshield cracked, it had to be fixed right. I scheduled the Safe Lake Auto Glass.
Oh, baby, I need your cards. Go get your stuff.
Fine with you? Then we calibrated my car to get it taken.
So, as you can see from the video, Crenshaw has mapped for us the failure of feminist theory and anti-racist politics to recognize discrimination against Black women on account of race and gender simultaneously and not exclusively as Blacks or women. As such, the experience of Black women are foregrounded in Crenshaw's analysis and womanist methodological approaches. I include the video because with the increase in feminist intersectional approaches to biblical interpretation, I have observed that some efforts fail to grasp Crenshaw's theory or give credit to the women scholars of color who first used an intersectional approach in their biblical interpretation. So now I turn to Sarah and Hagar as a case study in intersectional analysis. So back to my how I reluctantly got to this thing about maternal matters in biblical hermeneutics. Ironically, a biblical narrative that I found well suited for demonstrating my methodological approaches, combining an intersectional analysis of women affected by and affecting national projects with a womanist hermeneutic, is about two mothers. The story of Hagar and Sarah in Genesis 16 and 21 is a case study in motherhood and power dynamics. For many Black women religious scholars who embraced a womanist framework, Hagar was their patron saint. Black feminist and womanist religious scholars have been appropriating the stories of Hagar since they entered the academy as master's and doctoral degree students in the 80s and 90s. They are heirs to an older tradition of Africans enslaved in America appropriating biblical Hagar as their spiritual mother, and they as Hagar's children. Perhaps Hagar's story of surrogacy and forced exile, exemplified, as Katie Cannon described her, as someone who, quote, holds on to life in the face of formidable oppression, end quote. Leading the way was Dolores S. Williams, who found in Hagar a prototype for African-American women's quest for, quote, survival/quality of life, end quote, in their struggle against forced surrogacy, in Sisters in the Wilderness, The Challenge of Womanist God Talk. Wilma Ann Bailey asked whether Anabaptist feminists might adopt Hagar as a role model that reflects the lived experience of women from multiple racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic classes in Hagar, a model for an Anabaptist feminist. Renita Weems links the relationships between Sarah and Hagar with contemporary relationships between white and Black women in Just a Sister Away, a womanist vision of women's relationships in the Bible. There is also Diana Hayes' spiritual manifesto to Black Christian women in Hagar's Daughter, Womanist Ways of Being, that draw a line from 19th and 20th century Black women activists to Hagar. As she encourages Christian Black women to use their African heritage to draw strength in the struggle, she proclaimed that, quote, we are the daughters of Maria Stewart, of Ida B. Wells Barnett, of Harriet Tubman, of Sojourner Truth, of Mary McLeod Bethune, of Rebecca Jackson, of Zora Neale Hurston, and of Hagar, the rejected and cast out slave, mother of Ishmael, concubine of Abraham, and threat to Sarah, his barren wife, end quote. My interest in their story began in seminary when I read feminist and womanist treatments of the Sarah Hagar narratives as a seminary student at McCormick Theological Seminary. I wrote an exegesis paper on Hagar and Sarah using an intersectional lens of race, gender, sexuality, and power. Afterwards, I turned my attention to other interests. However, two related occurrences placed the story back on my scholarly radar. The first was a job interview that required that I give a lecture before the students and search committee. I chose to lecture on Sarah and Hagar because I had introduced their stories in a class I taught called Women in Biblical Literature. The assigned text, Helpmates, Harlots, and Heroes, Women's Stories in the Hebrew Bible, raised issues of ethnicity and race and gender in the Hebrew Bible. For most of my students, this was their first encounter with an African presence in the Bible and the intersection of race and gender in analyzing the power dynamics in the stories. I got the job, and the second occurrence was the invitation to revise the lecture for publication in the school's journal. This woman's son shall not inherit with my son, towards a womanist politics of belonging in the Sarah Hagar narratives, allowed me to continue to engage the feminist theory of gender and nation using an intersectional framework that I had begun in my dissertation. I have since revised and expanded this chapter for my forthcoming book, A Womanist Readings of the Hebrew Bible as the Politics of Belonging as an Outsider Within, as I have revised and honed my scholarship on this subject. I have come to see more fully how significant maternal matters are for the construction of these stories in nationhood and national processes in both the ancient world and contemporary world. As we engage the text, we first learn in Genesis 11:30 that Sarah, wife of Abram, was barren. And I might switch back and forth between Genesis 16, where it's Sarai and Abram, and Genesis 21, where it's Sarah and Abraham. As if to emphasize this point, the text adds that she had no child. Thus, motherhood, or the lack thereof, matters. The narrator reiterates this fact in Genesis 16 by reporting that Sarah bore Abraham no children. Older commentaries view Sarah's maternal status as Abraham's problem. His wife was barren, thus he had no heirs. But God had promised Abraham on at least 3 occasions that he would have descendants too many to count. But here we are, 4 chapters later, and Abraham still doesn't have a son. Thus, this pericope is often titled Promised Delayed. From a feminist or womanist perspective, the focus is on Sarah. Her infertility is seen through her eyes. The report that Sarah is still barren matters to her for at least 2 reasons. For one, some scholars suggest that in a patriarchal world, a woman's barrenness could be a source of shame, ridicule, and blame for failure. At least one scholar called it a, quote, misfortune of overwhelming proportions, end quote. For another, Sarah's social and economic stability depended on her having a male protector. As long as Abraham was alive, she was secure, but if he died, her circumstances would be tenuous. By definition in ancient Israel, a widow was a woman whose husband had died and left her without a male heir to take her into his home and care for her. Let's look first at Genesis 16. Now, Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children. She had an Egyptian slave whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "You see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my slave. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So, after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her slave, and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife. He went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be upon you. I gave my slave to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Your slave is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she ran away from her. And skip down to verse 15. Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. And at this point, I am borrowing generously from the revised and expanded version of my earlier article on Sarah and Hagar, and will walk you through what I mean by a womanist reading of the Hebrew Bible narratives as the politics of belonging. Sarah's socioeconomic status as a free woman of great wealth accords her at least one option to her barrenness. Sarah owned an Egyptian slave girl named Hagar, and ancient family legal codes granted her the prerogative as a barren wife to use her slave as a surrogate to attain motherhood and to avoid divorce. Surrogacy is one state of motherhood presented in the narrative. Surrogacy means appointed to act in the place of another. Sarah blames God for her predicament and orders Abraham to have sexual relations with Hagar to bear a child so that Sarah could be built up. So Sarah opts for surrogacy to become a mother. Marianne Kartzau explains that, quote, motherhood, traditionally connected to pregnancy, birth giving, and breastfeeding, is renegotiated and divided into 3 stages or qualities, end quote. In the discourse on surrogacy, the genetic mother whose eggs were fertilized to produce the child, the gestational or biological mother who carries and delivers the baby, the juridical or social mother who legally has the right to raise the child as her own. Thus, we find in the text 3 states of motherhood in Genesis 16. Juridical or social motherhood represented by Sarah, and genetic and gestational motherhood represented by Hagar. If Hagar becomes pregnant and gave birth, the child would belong to Sarah as the legal mother. Okay, that's. According to Raymond Westbrook, as Sarah's female slave, Hagar's sexuality and reproductive capacity were her mistress's possessions to exploit or dispose of, like any other beneficial aspect of property. The power differential between the 2 women based on the multidimensional intersection of ethnicity, gender, and legal status leaves Sarah in a position of power as a woman in a patriarchal society that has mostly gained recognition since the entrance of women biblical scholars in the academy. Sarah's plan is successful, and Hagar gives birth to a son, Ishmael. Although Hagar was the genetic and biological mother to Ishmael, it was in Sarah's personal interest that she be Ishmael's socio-legal mother. By providing Abraham with a legal heir and legatee, Sarah both retains her status and secures her economic future through motherhood. Things take a turn in Genesis 21, and the status of motherhood changes for both women. And I'm going to read that passage. Beginning at the first verse, the Lord dealt with Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son, whom Sarah bore him. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Now Sarah said, God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would ever have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac. The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring. Okay, lost my place. The narrator reports that God remembered Sarah and she conceived and gave birth to a son, Isaac. She has gone from social legal motherhood to biological and gestational motherhood, which in her situation carries a higher social esteem. Until now, Ishmael was still considered Sarah's son, although the writer refers to him as Hagar's son. Ishmael is also considered the firstborn of Abraham and patrilineal heir. The situation turns not just on Isaac's birth, but his weaning. Tammy Schneider notes that, quote, the feast and what it symbolizes caused Sarah to consider the relationship between Ishmael and Isaac in a new light because of Isaac's new situation, end quote. Ishmael is distanced by Sarah and the deity as Abraham's heir in favor of Isaac. In the political project of motherhood, biology, birth order, nor theologically determinative male genital circumcision combined do not make Ishmael an insider in Israel. The requisite for belonging is the right socio-judicial mother, Sarah, which gives Isaac the right credentials. Once the patrilineal line of descent has been safely secured by Isaac, Sarah secures a firm and future position for herself in Abraham's household through the birth of her son. Thus, Naomi Steinberg rightfully notes that, quote, a woman's power comes through her son. Only Sarah is the rightful mother of the nation of Israel, as she has the acceptable ethnic and class status. But it is only first with the help of Hagar, then the deity, that Sarah achieves this honorific. Motherhood matters. Contemporary correlations. The circumstances of the two women's life situations in the biblical narrative that determine who could be the mother of the son of promise, who could be the mother of the nation of Israel, turns on the politics of motherhood. I have been a staunch advocate for a woman or girl's right to be a mother or not, in part because I know the history of the involuntary motherhood of enslaved Black women in the US who were forcibly impregnated, gave birth to, and nursed both their children and their slave owners' children, sometimes one and the same, often only to have those children torn away from them. And with the knowledge that forced motherhood continues today for many Black women due to a lack of access to safe and affordable reproductive care that would allow them to choose motherhood on their own terms. Maternal matters have come to be significant for my recent research, given that Black women have the highest maternal mortality rate in the US. In contemporary US politics of belonging, maternal matters play out in population policies. In her article, Producing the Mothers of the Nation, Race, Class, and Contemporary U.S. Population Policies, Patricia Hill Collins traces how ideas of motherhood influence who gets to belong as a U.S. citizen and the government officials who decide using population policies as their guide. For example, Collins examine U.S. population policies targeted towards middle-class white women, working-class white women, African-American women, and undocumented immigrant Latinas to demonstrate how such regulations support the increased fertility of so-called desirable mothers and discourage the fertility of unfit, and that's in quotes, mothers. She found that middle-class and affluent white women who are considered emblematic of the nation enjoy less intrusive, privatized population policies. Black women who are treated as second-class citizens are deemed unfit to pass on national culture and therefore are subjected to coercive population policies. Collins remarks that because Black women are, quote, unfit, end quote, mothers, they become, quote unquote, undeserving of the benefits of belonging to the American national family. The social value of women in the US is in bearing children, but not just any children, but rather healthy white children for the national interests of the nation. Nira Yuval Davis, one of the pioneers in the feminist theory of gender and nation, makes the connection between population policies, abortion access, and citizenship. She maintains that, quote, population policies and women's reproductive rights are therefore closely interrelated, and both of them affect and are affected by the ways various nationalist projects view the size and quality of the quote unquote pool of genes in the national collectivity and how these should be controlled and reproduced. In conclusion, we have different power differentials at the intersection of gender, race, and class that make a difference in maternal matters in Genesis 16 and 21. In both the biblical text and the contemporary context, the control of sexuality and reproduction is often part of national processes. In the Hagar-Sarah narrative, 3 people or entities have power over reproduction. The deity has power over Sarah's reproduction. Sarah has power over Hagar's sexuality and reproduction. And the state has the legal codes that support the forced surrogacy of Hagar and today's population policies that control women's reproduction and sexuality. Depending on one's class, you can still get around roles. Wealthy women have access to reproductive care in the privacy of doctors' offices or other countries. Thus, poor and mostly women of color are the ones forced to give birth or be surrogates. Maternity matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lovelace. At this time, we will entertain your questions for Dr. Lovelace. You may put them in the chat or you may ask them yourself. I don't see any questions in the chat. If you have questions, you may ask them.
Will the tape be sent out to us? Can you hear me?
I do hear you, and I cannot answer that question.
It'll be put on Hood's YouTube page. So if you go to YouTube and you go to Hood Seminary, it'll be put on Hood's YouTube page, and it will also be put on the website as well.
Thank you. Uh,
The book is
I
scheduled to
have,
come out in June or July of this year.
okay. Anyone else?
Thank you.
Okay.
I have a question. Why did you choose Sarah and Hagar?
Because those were two narratives that I was able to use both the feminist theory of gender and nation and my womanist hermeneutic with the intersectional analysis of race, gender, and ethnicity and power dynamics.
Well, if no one else has a question, I have one. I'd like to ask, how does the church go about making a stand for more equity in childbearing and being able to make those choices for women?
I think the church has several roles. One, because if we don't have policies that allow for women to have healthy babies and to grow up in in households where they have the resources, where their parents are able to provide for their food, for their clothing, for their education, then it has a deleterious impact on our Black churches, on our communities where these children are growing up. Two, because of the high maternal mortality and infant mortality rate among Black women and children, that also has a bearing on Black families. If the mother dies in childbirth or if the mother dies but the child survives, who's left to raise that child is another matter. And three, because of the policing and the criminalization that we see of Black women's bodies and reference to to pregnancy and childbirth. I don't know if any of you followed the case in Ohio where the Black woman miscarried and they tried to charge her with a crime with the child's death for miscarrying. So all of those things have an impact on our Black church, on our Black families, our Black children.
Thank you. We have another question. How do we heal the gender and racial trauma in the church?
Well, that implies that, I mean, that's a generalization. I would certainly hope that not all churches have gender inequities and that those inequities are traumatizing for certain members of those congregations. But I think um, as we read the biblical text, the first text in Genesis is that God created the man and woman in God's image. And so if we look at the that God's image bears male and female, if we reflect that. And then even in the second creation story in Genesis 2, and then the so-called fall in Genesis 3, you still have God's original intention for the two humans, the man and woman, when the man in Genesis 2 is going through and trying to find a companion that is compatible for him, and goes through and says, it's kind of like, no, not this one, no, not this one, no, not this one. And then God brings the man, the woman, and the man says, finally, one like me, one who's in my mirror image and one who's compatible with me. And so that also implies an equality and an egalitarianness that was God's original intention for human beings. And that gets distorted when the two disobey God in the garden. But certainly that was not God's intention. And certainly if we believe that Christ reconciles us to God, then so does that original intention for creation and the egalitarian between the man and the woman.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions. We do have time for one more, if anybody has one.
I have a question. The second question that you answered, talking about the church getting involved in the women's rights, and that's political. And unfortunately, a lot of churches don't believe in this. They believe in the separation of the church and politics. I personally don't believe in that, but they believe in that. And a lot of churches do not like to get involved in the enactment of legislation that will protect women of color and give them the same advantages our peers have. That's all we're asking for, is to have equal health insurance or equal health, just like anybody else. So how do we get the church involved into that? Because we're talking about legislation.
The historical Black church has traditionally been involved in politics and legislation. Now, that could be a generalization, but we would not have gotten the Civil Rights Act if it had not been for the political activism and agitation of the Black church. So that is not new to us. And I think we forget that the Civil Rights Act wasn't just about Black equality, but it was also gender, that women were included. And so we overlook that it was extended not just to Black Americans having equal rights and equal access, but women also. And so by being engaged in getting the rights for Blacks as part of the church, and even when we look at some of the people who are on the ground that did a lot of the grunt work in the movement were women. And men will acknowledge that, how critical the women were in, when I talk about nationalist projects and processes, that women not only were affected by, but affected. It's the same with political activism, that women have not just been passive objects sitting by and letting things happen to them, but have been active, even if that is even as subtle as having the audacity to give birth in a society that wants to kill you and to kill your children. Is an act of politics. And so if you participate in that, you're certainly acting in a political act, participating in a political act. So we have a history of being engaged in politics. If you accept government grants to feed children, or for food programs, or educational programs, some schools, some churches run daycares and kindergartens or preschool. That's engaging in politics.
Thank you. I see a comment. I don't think that's a question. There are still churches that treat women as second-class citizens. Patriarchy is alive and well.
That
Sorry
is
to hear
true.
that. Yes.
That is certainly the case.
Mhm.
But the question was, how can we perhaps change that? And it's about power. I keep talking about power dynamics in these biblical stories, but they also apply in contemporary society in that no one wants to give up power or to share power. And so how do you get people to see the advantage? How do you get the men in the church to see the advantage of sharing the power with women? Um, would it make the church stronger?
That will certainly be a task to get to have
Everything's a
that
task.
We thank you so much for sharing with us this evening. And we encourage everyone to return to this Zoom on tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock as Dr. Lovelace will be with us again. Thank you for your time and your attention. Good night.
Night.